Okay, welcome everyone, and super excited to be here today. And today we are going to talk about design think and social innovation. It's a live webinar, and today is the 17th of June 2020. And I'm very excited because today we have John Kearns, the CEO of Partas and the EU expert and advisor for social enterprise. So I'm very glad to have John joining us today and making this webinar two-ended in the way that I'm sure John has much more experience than me in terms of the practicalities of social enterprise. So we are trying to handle this webinar from, I would say, from a perspective of theories, but also we want also some practice. So I'm sure John will help us in that. Okay, so guys, if you want to use on the right-hand side, you have the chat box in there. If you like to share where you are tuning in from, we will be very happy to see where you are tuning in from. And if you have any question, please just use the chat box to write down your question, and we will be happy to tune the presentation based on the question that we receive. Okay, so let's move to the agenda. So what we are going to see in this webinar? Well, first of all, we want to give you kind of a general introduction on who we are and why we are performing these webinars. Second, we want to spend a little bit of time introducing the concept of market failure. Why does market failure occurs, and what shape a market failure can actually have, and what social entrepreneurship can do about it. And then we are moving towards the point number 3, and we are introducing that the mindset of the designer. From a personal perspective, I see that there is an overemphasis on the process of design, but what we are understanding is that just the process of design without the mindset required to put an organization into a design thinking process, it won't really work. So I want to spend a little bit of time doing a kind of having a look of the designer mindset. And the last point is really giving you an introduction to the different business innovation theories that develop over time. And we decided to do that because when you want to innovate, you start to read books and start to look on the internet on which theory you can use. And what we have learned is that is always useful to try to understand how these theories develop. What was the reason behind that theory? So let's take a little bit of time to understand how these theories evolved and how you can actually apply to those theories to your organization. Okay, hi Keith, welcome from Toronto. It's amazing having you on board. And Jennifer is lovely from Dublin. It's lovely having you here today with us. Okay, so let's get started. A quick introduction. Who am I? My name is Stefano, for those of you that are joining us for the first time in this webinar, and I am a design strategist. And obviously is kind of a challenging name to exactly explain what the job of a design strategy is, but basically I help organizations to merge their existing strategy if they are aware of what the strategy is, but in terms of in which industry they are competing, what are the competitors, what are they trying to innovate. I merge that part that I would say is very rational, is very analytical with design. And design really helps organizations to formulate new strategy. And in a very fast-paced world as the one that we live in, it's better that organizations are aware of the two ways of thinking about strategy as something that is rational, but at the same time, something that needs to adapt to a changing environment. And on top of that, I work mostly remotely. Obviously, I work also face-to-face in many initiative together with John, but also I work remotely as we can't really, given the current circumstances, we can't really work in the same building. I'm really working remotely with different organizations around the world. So you can find more information about me at stefanomessori.com, and please feel free to connect on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Okay, now I hand over this 1 second to John, And I'm sure John has some words just to introduce himself and the work that he's doing both in Partas and at the European level. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Stefano. Yeah, I'm John Kearns. I'm CEO of Partas, and Partas is a social enterprise that helps people start businesses. It really tries to tackle unemployment and disadvantage through enterprise development. My own background has been very varied. I started in financial services. I became a sales manager for one of the large financial services organizations in Ireland. I've always then, alongside that, run my own businesses. I started various ideas and set up businesses and companies. So I have a lot of companies that I've set up that I continue to run. And then for the last 20 years, actually, I discovered this hidden world of social enterprise and what was called then the third sector. I was very familiar with the first sector and the second sector being government and the private sector. I knew nothing about this third sector. This sector that looked to the common good, that wasn't particularly chasing profit, where profit was not the metric, but achieving impact was what was important. And for the last 20 years, I've been working in that, making sense of it, because again, it was very different 20 years ago than it is now. And I've been lucky and privileged to be a part of that change that has been happening for the last 20 years in that sector. And we've seen sort of that even within that sector, that would have traditionally been only typified by the community and voluntary groups or charities. And we've seen the development of what was called, again, back then, 15, 20 years ago, the social economy, the concept of unity type business. And then that developed into social enterprise. And then from social enterprise, we saw the eminence of social entrepreneurship and social innovation. And now, of course, we're very deep into the world of social impact. So it has been fascinating to be part of that and to be playing a role in trying to shape that. I sit as an advisor to the European Commission, who are really incredibly active. If only national governments were as active and as concerned and as interested in this sector as the EU is. The EU understands that this sector can play a huge part in the entire economic life of a country. It might typically represent 8 to 10% of a national economy. And here, of course, it's way, way less. We're coming from a very low level. So the work goes on, and I was interested to read the programme for government over the last few days. A fascinating read, a long read, but just one mention of social enterprise, that they will continue with social enterprise, which worried me because it didn't look like they really understood social enterprise. So the fight goes on. I'm a bit of a contrarian. If you want me to tell you the truth, well, if you want to find out the truth, ask me. I will give it to you. I shoot from the hip, and I think that's typical of an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur sees really what's wrong, what can be improved, what should be better. That's also quite a good starting point for design strategy. We have to accept that things can be better. We have to accept that we shouldn't use assumptions, that let's go and check our assumptions. And that's the whole thing about social enterprise, about any kind of entrepreneurial thinking, about design thinking. Actually, we had it 40 years ago as well. We called it different things. We might have called it actually sales. Original old-fashioned sales started with a blank sheet. You knew nothing, make no assumptions, and listen to people. Ultimately, what design is. So I came across design first, maybe about 8 years ago, and I was quite cynical, and I kind of thought, yeah, don't know about this. And when it was actually with a professor from Belgium who was fantastic, but when she brought out the Lego and the plasticine and things like this, I thought, I don't need all of this. I can do it in my head. But I learned a bit of humility. I went with the process and was amazed and gobsmacked at how powerful and effective it was. And then I came across this fellow, Stefano, and he was also a convert to well, I think he had probably been a much earlier and much deeper convert to the world of time. So we've enjoyed merging the thinking of design and social enterprise and social innovation. And it's an ongoing journey. It's a journey that will probably never end, but it's fascinating and I thoroughly enjoy it. Back to you. Oh.
Thank you, John. That was a very good introduction to how you became familiar with social enterprise. And not to forget that actually we run a 8-week training course for social enterprise, social entrepreneurs, and introducing them to the impact that design thinking can bring to their value proposition. And it's fair to say that was quite successful. And I am amazed to see how human-centered design and social entrepreneurship really go hand in hand. Something that I wouldn't have necessarily known coming from a private sector where we don't talk too much of social impact yet, but it's something that I suppose it will come on the agenda pretty much soon.
Already is very much on the agenda.
Yeah. And those companies that are not getting ready for it, I think will be the company that will have trouble in the near future, because if you are making profit at the expense of society, that will reflect sooner or later, even in your income level, because consumers want to know where you are sourcing those products, those raw material. And if you are not sustainable, you can't hide that anymore. I mean, YouTube is a vehicle that we can use to report any activity that is not only legit, but is not sustainable from the point of view of humanity. So I think the transparency is really a big word that is coming towards us in many different shapes and forms.
There's another aspect there, sorry, Stefano, just to add to that. The biggest problem that big companies all around the world face now is recruitment and retention. That's the biggest impediment to their success and their profitability. And the newer, younger generations, the millennials and them, they care about what kind of values their company, the company that they will work for has. They care a lot and they check it out. So where many years ago we would have seen a kind of a tokenistic acceptance of corporate social responsibility, and let's face it, a kind of whitewashing thing. It was more kind of a we better add this to what we do. But now there is a genuine understanding of the importance of the triple bottom line and impact that you have in the pursuit of profit.
So you are saying that it's not only your customer, but actually your employees that won't be working for you unless they see that there is an impact in the company.
Absolutely, and they have the choice now. And companies spend a lot of money. I mean, that was a business that didn't exist in my day, back 40 years ago. Now, employment recruitment is a huge business for which they get paid a huge fee. Finding the right people, that's the most important thing to companies now.
Wow. So that is a piece of insight that I wasn't particularly aware. I was aware more on the customer perspective. But if you look at your employees as your internal customers, that will make a lot of sense in that perspective. Now, the first concept that we are going to introduce in this webinar is the concept of market failure, a concept that I believe everyone in the audience is familiar with, but I would like to create a visual about this. And market failure really happens when we have a problem in society. And conventionally, what would you think that is happening is that either the government or the private sector try to find a solution. Well, the government simply uses public money to try to create accommodation if there is lack of accommodation. And say that the government is not able to provide enough accommodation, then somebody in the private sector see that as an opportunity, invest money into building new accommodation, and try to make a profit out of it. And that is what we have been saying, for many, many years, either the government or the private sector were trying to solve a problem. Now, the private sector was also trying to make a profit out of it. But a market failure occurs when neither the government or the private sector are tackling a societal problem. So we are stuck. So what has been happening, and that is very interesting, is that there is someone that could be a local startups that they see a problem in there and say, oh, look, the established organizations are not really doing anything about this, and the government is not achieving the impact that it should have in the local community. So all of a sudden, you have somebody that is a disruptor and sees that there is a problem in society, and they start to do something about it. Now, in personal experience, this person is not necessarily somebody that wants to start an organization. Is a citizen that they see that there is something wrong and start to create a movement around it. So it doesn't necessarily have all the economic insight, the business analytics in front of it, but it starts to create traction around that problem. And personal experience, I've seen people in the private sector and also in government that see a problem and they start to act as intrapreneur. People within an organization that sees a possibility either to create profit for it, or if it works within the government, to enhance the local community and start to put traction in that initiative. So when we say, disruptive startups, that can also be happening within existing organization. So if this is kind of market failure, what is happening in the business landscape? What is changing? Well, what we have now for the first time after many, many, many years is that now we avail of what I call the Designer Toolkit, that are tools that we avail nowadays that enable us to empathize with the local citizens and try to understand what is wrong in the communities where I live. Now, if you take the first step of design thinking, really start with observation. And as simple as just take a walk around your area. And if you come in Dublin, I reassure you, if you go for a walk in Dublin in the city center, after 5 minutes that you walk, you have perceived at least 25 issues that can be tackled if somebody start a journey of discovery. Start to understand what can we change in our community that is broken. And while in a way we think that this is not our responsibility, I think nowadays really innovation is not the innovation as we see it in the past. And I define that it is innovation 1.0, where you require the genius with all the insight coming to earth and tell us what to do. But rather I perceive innovation as 2.0, where everyone is responsible to innovate. And that really relates to the fact that doesn't really matter. Are you just a citizen? Are somebody working with the government or the private sector? Now we have the tools that enables us to frame innovation. We don't need necessarily to be born geniuses. I can make famous name of people that disrupt the computer industry. We don't need to be those. We are just the people that see that there is something that is not working, familiarize with new tools that design bring to the fore, and I think impact can be generated. John, do you have a view on this? Do you think this makes sense, or is something that maybe you have a personal experience on this topic?
Well, I can give you a very recent example. We run 4 enterprise centers, and I had been working remotely with the people who were setting it up, in the protocols and the signs and all of this type of thing. And they had everything in place, but I hadn't been there, so I hadn't looked at it. And only last week I went up to see how it was looking, was everything in place. And it was interesting with fresh eyes, things I hadn't noticed. So the important thing, of course, are the notifications and the positioning of the hand sanitizers. I missed some of them. I didn't spot them. Now, I wondered, how did I miss them? Were my eyes closed? So I went back to walk back in, and it was simple things like that. When, for instance, you came in the door, we have a coffee shop, so your attention is drawn to the left-hand side. Now, where was the hand sanitizer? On the wall with the right-hand side. Nothing was going to draw your attention to it there. It's a really stupid, small example, but you've got to observe as not, I mean, people who put all these things in place were observing, but they weren't observing as through the eyes of somebody who was walking in there for the first time. And there were other kind of examples of that. There was a guy sitting on a stool, and I presumed he was waiting for his coffee. He'd ordered coffee and thing. And he was the guy who was supposed to tell me where to go. But because I didn't look at him, I thought it would be a bit rude to sort of examine him, right? And I kind of walked past him. He was the concierge type person. So again, the thinking was there, but the thinking hadn't gone all the way through. We hadn't walked it in the shoes of a member of the public coming through. And I'm not a member of the public, but I missed all of these things. So it's just a very small example of how you've got to be diligent in the process of observation. And then the rest follows too, I think. Observation is kind of one of the key requirements.
Yeah. And I think education didn't really enable us to become better observer. Actually, education may be just intake that information, and that will enable you to understand how the world works. But the reality is that you need to use your own senses, look, explore, and be curious, and things will clarify to you. But thank you, John, for that example, real case example. Now, if market failure as a concept is clear to everyone, let's explore the design thinking mindset and how can help us to become better observer and explorer. And the first thing that I want to say is that conventionally in business, we always use rational thinking. And the example that I use is always the example of the luggage, because it's very easy to understand. So if you think that you are working in a luggage manufacturing company before luggage was on wheels, and you are an engineer, or you work in the manufacturing or in the production plant at some stage, well, what would happen within that organization is that your engineer, your research and development department spend their life in their laboratory and try to make that luggage somehow, between common, better for the final user, which means that you try to make it lighter, to make it better looking, to make it a little bit more ergonomic for the final user. And that is all good. But the byproduct of this effort is what we call incremental innovation. You start from the idea of luggage and you ended up with a better luggage. What we need to do in order to tackle a societal problem is not incremental innovation, unfortunately. What is required to tackle a societal problem is needed to embrace creativity. And human-centered design is really the way that enables us to stop being the engineer working in R&D within an organization and start to go where the user that you want to serve is. And obviously, imagine you go, for example, at an airport or a train station and start to not to think about the luggage, but start to observe the experiences of the user, of the traveler in this case, and start to look, what are they doing? What is what we call that in design, the job to be done? What is the traveler trying to achieve with the luggage? Well, you start to see that the first thing that they do when they, if they are on a taxi or whatever vehicle they use to the airport, well, the first thing that they do, they put the luggage on a trolley and they push the trolley. And that goes back to the important observation. So all of a sudden, you are able to understand if the job that they're trying to do is made with a trolley, yeah, partially you can see the luggage as a container, but mostly what people do is really transportation, so mobility. So you attach the idea of mobility to the luggage that when you start to prototype, that reflects itself with wheels. Now, obviously, now is easy because we have all the, is already up, is already happening that we have luggage on wheels. But imagine to be, the manufacturer of conventional luggage, unless you are creative and embracing human-centered design, exploring the experience of the customer, you will never come up with a luggage on wheels because you didn't have that experience. You didn't empathize with your final user. And I just want to take the time to explain that in business, any successful business, yes, need the rationality of a business model, the rationality of new material. You can use Kevlar, very light material to manufacture your luggage. But it's only when you embrace creativity that perception really shift from luggage as a container to luggage understood as mobility, and then innovation really happens. And to tackle the societal problem, my bet is that we need to embrace creativity and bring that to the new level. Now, guys, if you have any questions or any comment, please use the chat box. And that was kind of in a nutshell is what is required in business in order to become more sustainable. We need to look at what is happening in our user life and try to make sure that we are delivering on the requirements on our user and not what we believe the requirements are. And that tells a lot also on the success of an organization. Many times organizations don't fail because they are not able to deliver the product, but rather because they start with a product or service that nobody wants. And that is a double, both society and the company is losing. And I think design really can enable us to bridge that gap. Okay. So the last point that I want to explore here is the evolution of business innovation theory. I think that can give us a lot of understanding of, okay, if I buy in this concept of design, if I want to expand my horizon and try to understand how can I use different theories in order to beef up my reasoning when I need to create a new startups, or I want to propose within my organization a new idea. What can I use? What are the tools that we can use? Well, I want to look at this in a historical development. And if we look the tools really that we had available in, let's say, just 50 years ago, the only tools that we had were the tool of business strategy that have been around for, let's say, from, let's say, 1950s, when all the strategic theories were created in Harvard Business School. Those theories, if you take, for example, the value chain. The value chain is a theory that enables you to look at the activities that your company performs in order to deliver your product or service. And if you are an established organization, you can still use this framework and look at how those activities impact society in a bad way and try to reduce the negative impact. This could be already an opportunity for impact. What you're doing in there, you are trying to minimize, for example, the obvious impact that you have if you are a large organization could be pollution. So you say, where should I start to think about an internal perspective of design can also be applied internally. It doesn't need necessarily to be applied with your final user. And say, oh, actually, I see maybe that there is a certain technique in the way that I procure my raw material that actually can be placed in more efficient. And by doing that, I reduce the cost of procurement. And that could be a viable, opportunity for using design. And actually, design might help you to foresee new way on how you procure your raw material. And that most of the time can be also, what if I procure my products and service from the local community rather than procuring that from, let's say, another country where there are expenses of pollution for transportation? Maybe that can give you idea on kind of fostering the local cluster of organizations that are connected somehow to yours. So you see, people say, well, business strategy is outdated. But if you look business strategies and this framework with a new, I would say, a modern point of view, you can see they still very insightful. And I think many companies, multinational corporations, sometimes they don't take the time to look at their value chain with a design perspective. How can I change? How can I look at the concept of procurement from a new perspective? Is changing the understanding of procurement, you remember, from luggage to be a container to luggage as a mobility. You need to bring the same shift in perception in the way that you perform the activities. And obviously the value chain is still a very relevant framework. And there are many. If you take, for example, industry analysis, how can you understand the industry not only from, I would say, a snapshot, a static study, but rather looking at the industry, how is changing, and how can you expand the overall pool of profit of your industry? So all these frameworks that were developed in the 50s, I think they're still valuable. There is a fundamental truth, but they need to be seen and used with a new perspective. Now, that is kind of the first tools that we can use when we want to start to create a more sustainable business. And this go back to the 1950s. So what happened though? Because, as business theory about innovation and creativity evolve over time, well, it's very interesting linking business strategy with a lean startup methodology. And the way that lean startup start to gain traction, that happened around 2010, when actually an engineer, Eric Rice, and he was an expert on how production happens within an organization, try to minimize the waste in the production process. So he said, can we apply the lean production methodology or method to the way that we generate new idea? And then the lean startup was created. And basically, if you look, there are different tools that we can use in order to create, to make our innovation process a little bit leaner. But the one that I would say had one of the biggest impact in the way that we think about new businesses is the business model canvas. Now, if you are just a startup, I would suggest another framework. I'll type here in the chat. It's called the Lean Canvas. That is another framework. It looks similar to this, but there is more of the design approach. So the left side of this chart will be more focused on the user. But basically, why was this a very good contribution, and how can you start using it? Well, basically, in 9 boxes, this framework enables you to look at the value proposition that you want to create for your customer segment and try to understand how can I create something that is valuable to my user while generating a profit. So it basically was able to, I would say, shrink what we have in a business plan, let's say 90, 100 pages, in one single canvas. And I think that enables many people to think more clearly at what they are trying to do. Now, one suggestion that I give all the time is, when you think about lean startup and when you think about the canvas particularly, we can use the canvas at different level. And I'm afraid to say that I work with different organizations, and I know that the way that the canvas is used most of the time is just as a collection, is just a kind of an hypothesis checking list. So basically what organizations do, try to throw post-it on the different boxes and say, that is my business model. That can be used as kind of a checklist. But I think if you just stop in there, you are losing most of the power of the business model canvas. What you can really start to create is not only writing down your assumption, your checklist of assumption, but rather to create a story behind those assumptions. And in there, you start to connect the value proposition box with the customer segment box and say, okay, my value proposition is so that meet the needs of a customer segment that is underserved, and by doing that, I can create a stream of revenues that will enable me to be profitable. And I think more and more of our ideas to change or to improve the world really need that rationality. And let me tell you something. If you work within an organization, or if you want to start your organization and you are trying to pitch what you are trying to do, you need to be able to articulate the story. You need to be able to tell me what you are trying to do. If you are not able to tell me the connection between the boxes, I think you will face a challenge when it comes to sell your idea or to get people involved in what you are trying to do. So creating that story behind your business model is absolutely essential. And the last level that we can use the business model canvas and the lean startup method is not enough to create one business canvas. What you need to do is to generate different canvases with different hypotheses, going out, test those hypotheses with the final user, and see what is working and what is not. So it tells you that basically, if you take any a process of entrepreneurship, is really iterative. It's very difficult that we get that right the first time. So trying to develop different business model canvas, develop the story that connects the different dots, and kind of refine those assumptions by validating them with the final user, also will de-risk your innovation effort. And John, have you been using the Lean Canvas, or what is your take on the Lean Canvas?
I suppose I have a kind of whether you take the Lean Canvas or whether you take the traditional old-fashioned business plan, I think that the key in all of it is discipline. It imposes a discipline. And some of the, I did my master's on entrepreneurship, and I suppose being the kind of person I was, I didn't take the most straightforward route of entrepreneurship. There was a very famous professor called Ketz de Vries, who wrote a very interesting thesis on the dark side of the entrepreneur. And at that stage, what interested me is because everybody is painting out entrepreneurs as the most wonderful people in the world, and social entrepreneurs even better. They're saints and they're geniuses and they're all of this type of thing. The reality is entrepreneurs are weird people. They have flaws, and most studies will tell you that a lot of the entrepreneurship comes from a flaw. It's a bit like the pearl in the oyster. It's an irritant, something that causes people to do these things and become entrepreneurs. And when you look at some of the negative points about an entrepreneur, they're not always very disciplined. They're very difficult people to work with quite a lot of the time. Their mind will be all over the place, 20 different things at the one time. They change their mind 10 times a day. They have an instinctive gut for what they need to do, but they haven't had the business discipline. They're not always great at running business. So what I think about the startup or the Lean Canvas or the any of these kind of tools, even the old-fashioned thing, like the old-fashioned business plan, you put a lot of work into writing it, and then when you're finished, you put it away and you never looked at it again. That was the reality. People did not really, but the key important, and we still suggest to people they should do it at least, because it imposes the discipline of having to think and having to write down these things. And this is a very organized way of making yourself confront things at a slower pace than your mind might work, because it's very easy to kind of run some of these things off in your mind. Put it down on paper, and actually once you start writing it down and it slows down your thinking, you start to see the flaws, or you start to see other connections. So it's really, really valuable to do this, but it's a thing that entrepreneurs hate doing. And it's a discipline that they really need because it will help them set up a more sustainable business that's more well thought out, where all the values and connections start to make more sense.
Absolutely. That actually makes me think that if you look at the reason why entrepreneurship, generally speaking, but any new initiative have very little chances to gain traction, let's say that maybe one out of, if we are optimistic, one out of them of new initiative really fails, is not necessarily that the idea is not good, but the person behind the idea wasn't able to create around himself or herself those connections that enabled the person to really to gain traction with the idea, because he's not able maybe to externalize those thinking. So maybe the art of visualization and the art to kind of having that discipline can enable that person maybe to be more successful, because is enabling them to have that conversation that is needed in design thinking. But that point really leads us from this theory of lean startup methodology to what is called design thinking. And is interesting between lean startup methodology and design thinking, the way that innovation theory developed was only few years. So lean startup 2010, design thinking around 2013, 2014. And it's interesting what design thinking bring to the table for entrepreneurs, managers, and anyone that really want to make change happen is the first 2 points, really the observation, as we started this webinar focusing on the importance of becoming observer and looking at the user in their native environment and try to spot those what we call not necessarily unmet needs, but even more deeper, that are unarticulated, that are a set of needs that your customer is not able to tell you about. In fact, if you go to your customer and say, what do you want? Well, they will say, I just want a better version of what you are offering me and possibly half of the price. That is what we normally get of our user. So if you went to a traveler that had an hand luggage, and you ask, what can I really do for you? They will say, well, I want a lighter luggage, a better luggage. He will never tell you, I want a luggage on wheels, because that is your job to create something that really exceed the expectation of your final user. And obviously, after you have observed the reality around you, and that is remind us how anthropology and psychology now are becoming business discipline. Before they were they were part of humanistic, understanding, trying to better understand how the brain works. But those disciplines now are actually very valuable in businesses, because what we are trying to do is try to understand what is happening in the brain of our users and try to look at what they are doing and whatever they are behaving, and not listening to them too much, but rather observing them and access those needs that they are not able to tell you about. And after we have observed, we translate those observations not in reports that nobody reads, but rather we transform those observations into very large visual. And we create what is called the customer journey mapping, the user personas. Why we are doing that? We are doing that because what we want to do is to get people in our team that is working on the project, but also what I call the extended team, people that have intelligence in the industry in which we want to innovate. And we invite them, and we create this moment in time called the art gallery. We display all the results of our research in terms of visual, and say, guys, what do you see in there? What is your intuition? What is that piece of research telling us about? Now, remember, these are large visuals, so we enable them to put, notes in the part of that particular research, put another notes, and we close that particular event with a discussion about what is emerging. So in there, what we are trying to do is try to dig deeper into the minds of our user and try to understand what is the user trying to tell us that is not able to. And that is kind of very useful exercise. And I think, in a way, complement the work of the entrepreneurs as the person with all the inspiration, and complement that with people that are really enabling that entrepreneurs to have a richer perspective on what is happening in the industry, and also invite the final user into prototyping and testing. And listening to the user not only at the beginning of our design thinking process, but rather to co-create the solution with our final user. What does it mean? It means after we have ideated something that changes the current order of things, so we have used creativity, we change the perception of the customer problem, then what we do, we create an artifact with a minimal investment, so could be a paper prototype, and we invite our user to see, oh, what do you think about what I'm doing? And what amazed me most of the time, that you can really start with a paper prototype that just costs you barely anything. And then you hand that over to your user, and you start to see that whatever you were expecting to happen doesn't, because the user use whatever you have created in a way that is different from what you were foreseeing. So inviting the final user to that really helps you to minimize the cost of innovation, actually the risk of innovation. And obviously, when we move from just a paper prototype, low cost prototype, to a working prototype, we will want to test that with a higher number of users and try to see, is there a trend that is emerging? Should we change that feature or the other feature? And only scale that to full production when we had validated that not only there is a demand for our product, but actually that the product it creates enough value for our users that justify the cost of production. So in that way, if you are working within an organization, you have to say, well, actually design really enables us to de-risk our innovation effort. And that, I think, is a very good selling point for starting to develop this approach of design for a social enterprise. But that really leads us to what is happening now. If we move from business strategy, lean startup, the idea that we can be leaner in the way that we create new business model, new business value proposition, and design brought the user as part of the conversation. For the first time, we realized that, I think John has a lot to say on this. I mean, possibly he was using design thinking in his career as a first point for selling. And John, I suppose the first point in sales is try to understand what is the need of the final user. So you were using, in a way, already design thinking.
Yeah, I mean, the skill of sales was usually active listening, what we called active listening. The art of listening, and not listening to the words, but listening to what was behind the words. What was the person really saying? What was their real problem? And then watching how they spoke, watching what they got excited about, watching what was what we used to call the hot button, because the role of the salesperson was to turn needs into wants. So you had to understand the person's needs. Now, they didn't necessarily know what they needed, so it was your job as a salesperson to go and listen to them, let them talk, and it really should be them speaking, not you. Again, there was a lot of expressions back then, selling isn't telling. So, stop telling people what they need. Listen. It's a listening exercise, and it's an active listening exercise. Listening to what's behind it. Where's the pain? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to avoid pain or gain pleasure? The pain-pleasure principle. And understanding fully as you could. A bit like a doctor diagnosing a patient. You go into a doctor with a problem. The doctor is listening and asking questions, and is not just listening to exactly what you're saying. They're watching the way you respond. They're watching the physical movements. They're watching everything. And that's kind of the same for innovation, for design thinking, for selling. These are all just ways of being open, with open eyes, open ears, to what a person's needs are.
Yeah. The observation that I want to do, to make in there, John, is that sales can use design and start to be kind of to really try to understand what the customer is trying to say and turn the wants into needs. But I suppose if you only use, let's say, design at that point, well, the whole product probably is already being created. So the leverage that you can use is based on what is available. If we start to use the design at the early stage, well, we only produce a product that we already know that the customer wants. We just need to make that a possible user and convert that into a customer, being able to appreciate what the offering is. But instead of expecting the salesperson to be open and to be kind of a good designer, I think we need to, what design does very well is that places the observation at the beginning, even before the product is ready. So when you reach sales, you know that basically you have created something that the customer really wants.
Well, hopefully that's what the marketing department have done for the salesperson, because sales and marketing go together. And people often think marketing is about advertising, and it is not about. Marketing is the bit that comes before sales. Marketing is that design process. You know, marketing is about understanding intimately what are the needs and wants of your target population. And it also strikes me, by the way, that you know, there's an underlying big truth behind all of this. So whether you're looking at it from a sales and marketing perspective, a proper sales and marketing perspective, or a design perspective, or a business strategy perspective, the one truth behind it is the same. And I've been very interested for a long time in economics. Indeed, one of my favorite business books is Black Swans by Nicholas Taub, who's an economist. And that's what economy is all about. Again, we kind of tend to think economy is about money and sort of the gross profit, gross national product, and all of that type of thing. Actually, economics is about spotting people's trends, people's actions. Economics is about observation. So again, we can bring in economics, enterprise, sales, marketing. They're all part of the one thing, which is how do we fulfill what is best, and how can we fulfill that most efficiently and less wastefully? They're all skills. I think design thinking, though, and as somebody who's been around a long time and tried a lot of these and been involved in a lot of these techniques, design thinking is probably the most complete for me, in that it follows through logically all the way through. The reality is, and this is again part of the whole thing about the entrepreneur, the kind of the myth of the fantastically genius entrepreneur. Some entrepreneurs are just lucky. Because they're such a weird person, they happen to come up with that one thing which not in a million years would you arrive at by design or by Porter's forces or by sales and marketing. And actually one of my ventures that was extremely successful was so wacky, so weird. It was turned down by at least 20 big, important, respectable people who said, "Are you mad?" And sometimes you are mad, and sometimes you need to be a bit mad to go to where sometimes there's a little seam of gold. But design thinking is the most complete, I think, in that it will up the odds in relation to actually hitting a seam.
Yeah. No, definitely. And basically on the closing line of this journey that we have been together, I think what is happening now, because finally we have the toolkit that we didn't avail before, or better, maybe there was already the practice of design and the practice of strategy, but I think now we share a responsibility. Now, before this process wasn't coded. So it was something mysterious. What should I do? I think nowadays we all share a responsibility in here to shift from the mindset of, okay, is what John was describing. I am the entrepreneurs and I have the insight to what the product should be. I can see like fully formed. Okay. And in those case scenario, you have the genius within a company that does 99% of the visionary job, and the other people are just merely implementers. They don't need to think. They just need to do exactly what they are told to. Okay. And I think I define personally this as innovation 1.0. And with all respect to the people that can be that genius, I respect them, but they are not the average person. And my belief, when we talk about democratization of innovation, we need to make sure that the people that not necessarily are so insightful, they weren't born geniuses. I think what design does very well brings to the forth a set of tools and a process and a mindset where even those people that see something that they want to challenge, well, they can create around themselves a movement or an environment, a culture for innovation. So my suggestion, and I think the outcome of this webinar, is that innovation ultimately is a team sport, and is starting that conversation within our organization. Doesn't matter, are we working in government? Are we working in the private sector? Or are we just people that want to change the order of things? I think before was a challenge. Before we didn't really know where to start. I think nowadays our responsibility is to get other people in the process with us, in the journey with us, obviously being an observer, being curious, but unless you are able to generate an interest of people around you that they can join you, well, alone is very difficult to change something that is challenging society, because there are many, many layers of hierarchy that you need to break before you are able to achieve that impact that you want. And my personal perspective possibly is kind of a younger generation perspective, but it's just that you need to create that movement. I name that as the tribe that will support you every time there is kind of an obstacles, and you need some inspiration or some strength behind you that keeps you going. So I really believe that we are ready to shift from the genius entrepreneurs, and all the respect for people that are that way, but also people that are not necessarily genius, to be somebody that brings that environment and that culture for innovation to the fore. Now, that was pretty much from us, and this is kind of the closing slides that brings together the importance of the ecosystem for social entrepreneurship, challenging what is a societal problem. I don't think, only one of these three players can find the solution, but it's only when there is government that is aligned with business, that is aligned with those informal leaders, they start to create that conversation. I think this is when actually social impact will start to be more visible. Because if you have only one actor that is pulling in one direction, but you don't have a local government that support informal leaders in terms of funding or in terms of tax breaks in order to create those value proposition, I think that will be a little bit challenging. So that is kind of, say, we need to create in our community, we don't need to look at those problems as compartmentalized, so divided in compartments, but rather societal problems are very complex. And we need to create traction at the different level and to create an ecosystem that enables the different sector coming together, create that conversation. And that is the reason why those, the culture of design, the culture of change, of creating empathy for our users really need to be understood not only at the private level, but really need to be understood through the three sector. And creating that alignment is essential for the impact as to has to happen. We need to see that there are clustering of social enterprise taking shape, strengthening one another, and really change will happen. Probably John has some, maybe an example, or he maybe experience a place where they were able to achieve that kind of ecosystem or alignment.
Yeah, it is actually one of the key areas that the European Union is looking at the moment, this whole clustering thing. And like an example that I know, for instance, it's kind of a very Irish example in a way, but down in the southeast of Ireland, again, there's been a problem in that rural Ireland feel that they've been left behind. As part of the whole urbanization that's been happening in every other country, including Ireland, whole tracts of the country feel left behind. And in the southeast, there has been a development of social enterprise in clusters. And by maybe about now at this stage, 20, 25 companies that have set up purely to sort of support that local economy in the southeast of Ireland, to make it attractive, to create business, create tourist attractions. They've created a UNESCO center, and it's the interaction of it as well. And all of this, by the way, on really scant resources, which has been sort of very impressive. But it's the support they've been able to give each other, and then draw attention. So they're not just drawing attention locally; they're drawing attention nationally and internationally, and that is helping them to achieve what they're ultimately trying to do: achieve sustainable communities in their region. And so that's just kind of one example. But there's so many examples right across of sector of where you're even within the sector, where it might be purely within food, might be obviously within IT and software and things like this. But
you think this will be in the agenda for the next few years?
It's number one on the Commission's agenda, because the general clustering is very strong in the EU. And don't forget, we had an ambition to be the strongest economy in the world, the EU, by 2020. We didn't quite hit it, but that was the aim. And one of the key ways that they saw they would do it would be by adopting the clusterization process that, for instance, we had seen in the US. I mean, the most famous example really is Silicon Valley. But then you can kind of go back in Europe and what's the name of the place in Spain? There's effectively nearly an entire city in Spain that has created a cluster of social enterprise, and it is run now as one huge cooperative city. I can't think of the name of it now, but there are examples all over, and it is a priority. It's already successfully working in the private and commercial sector, and the priority now is to see the social sector, the third sector, adopt clusterization as a strategy for scaling and sustainability.
That's brilliant, John. Well, thanks a million for sharing that. And I suppose that, if we have to look in the next possibly 10 or 20 years of what is happening in business and in society, I think that there is a full agenda for any organization. Doesn't matter if it is government, private organization that are already existing and delivering value, but also for startups. And it's only when they come together that I think a region or an area can really merge the profitability of business with the social impact that can be achieved. Thank you, John, very much for being us today, for bringing your expertise and real case example. And thank you, everybody, for joining us live. And I'll see you next week for another webinar.